Welcome, dear friends, to a gentle journey through the world of Elden Ring. Tonight, we will wander through the ancient and fractured realms of the lands between, where the gods once walked and the demigods now rule. This world, split by the shattering of the Elden Ring, is filled with sorrow, power, and the echoes of forgotten dreams. The story of the demigods, born from the eternal Queen Marika and the mighty Radagon, is one of tragedy, ambition, and destiny. As we explore their lore, we will find the threads of hope and ruin woven deeply into their bloodlines, and we will uncover the deep struggles that shaped their fates. Take a deep breath now as the weight of the world slowly falls away. Let your body soften, your thoughts quiet, and your heart find peace. Feel the warmth of the night embrace you as you sink deeper into rest, each exhale carrying you further into this tranquil journey. And if you find yourself drifting through stories like this, where worlds both ancient and magical come alive in the quiet moments, you're welcome to subscribe and softly tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let us begin as the whispers of the demigods call us forth, guiding us into their fractured yet beautiful world. In the beginning, the Elden Ring was whole, a symbol of unity and order, the very essence of the world's stability. The Elden Ring, encased in a radiant glow, cast its power over the lands between, binding the world together, its will known to all who dwelled within. It was a time of peace, but peace, like all things in the world, was fragile. Beneath its gleaming surface, the seeds of decay had already been sown, whispered promises of power and eternal rule calling to the hearts of the gods, those who felt the weight of their immortality too heavily upon their shoulders. The ring, much like the gods themselves, was always meant to endure, yet even it, in its strength, was vulnerable. It was not the gods alone who felt the weight of time, but the land itself. The world grew restless, the roots of the Elden Ring trembling beneath the surface, as if it too was beginning to question the necessity of eternity. The peace it granted had been taken for granted, and slowly the bond between the Elden Ring and the demigods who inherited its grace began to fray. Radagon, the Golden King, known for his wisdom and strength, watched over the Elden Ring with an iron grip. Yet in his heart there stirred a yearning, an impossible wish to break free of his duties. He was bound not just to the Elden Ring, but to the very forces that it governed. And in his heart, he longed for something more, something beyond the rules of the gods. In his quiet moments, he began to wonder if perhaps it was time for change. Queen Marika, the Eternal, stood by his side, her presence as unwavering as the stars themselves. She was the heart of the world, its creator, its protector. Yet even she could not escape the burdens of eternity. The gods, in their immortal wisdom, had created a world that was now slowly crumbling under its own weight. The promise of eternity had become a prison, a gilded cage from which escape seemed impossible. And so, the queen too began to wonder if there was another way. It was then that the whispers began. Subtle at first, they crept through the vast halls of the golden capital, whispering of power, of freedom, of a world unbound by the chains of the Elden Ring. The demigods, who had long been under the ring's dominion, began to listen to these whispers. They had grown strong in their own right, their bloodlines tied to the Elden Ring itself. Yet even they felt the stirrings of a desire to break free, to carve their own fates from the fabric of the world. Morgott, the Omen King, once a proud and noble demigod, had felt the sting of being bound to the will of others. His fate had been marked by others, his true self hidden beneath the weight of his own curse. The scars of his past ran deep, and in the silence of his heart, he began to plot the rise of his own destiny. But it was not only Morgoth who felt the tremors of change. Millennia, the blade of Miquella, had long fought against the corruption of the world. Her battle against the scarlet rot, a symbol of her struggle against the world's decay, was a constant, unyielding fight. Yet in her heart, even Millennia could feel the whispers, urging her towards something greater, something beyond the ring, beyond her curse. The Three Fingers, a dark and forbidden influence, waited patiently in the shadows, their intentions veiled in secrecy. The flame of chaos they nurtured promised freedom from the shackles of fate. It was a fire that burned with an insatiable hunger, one that would destroy the old world to make way for something new. Yet even as they whispered, their influence was felt like the first winds of a coming storm, tugging at the edges of the demigods' hearts. And so the stage was set. The Elden Ring, once unbreakable, now trembled on the edge of destruction. The demigods, once united under its rule, now stood divided. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first crack to appear, the first fracture that would send the Elden Ring shattering into pieces. And in that moment, when the first breath of rebellion was drawn, everything changed. The shattering was not a single event, but a process, a quiet, drawn out tear that stretched across the fabric of reality itself. It was the moment the world began to bleed, and from that blood the demigods would rise. As the Elden Ring fractured, so too did the peace that had once held the lands between together. The demigods, their fates intertwined with the ring, each took a piece of its shattered glory, and in doing so, began the war that would reshape the very foundation of their world. Radagon, in his desperation to control the ring's power, tore it apart, unaware of the consequences that would follow. His actions, though born of a desire for freedom, would only serve to deepen the world's sorrow. And as the ring shattered, so too did the bonds that held the gods together. Queen Marika, heartbroken by her husband's actions, was left to pick up the pieces, her dreams of eternity slipping further away. And so, the Elden Ring shattered, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of its former glory. The world was no longer whole, and the demigods, once tied to its power, now found themselves adrift, their destinies uncertain, their fates scattered like the fragments of the ring itself. As the world around them began to crack and splinter, the demigods, children of the Elden Ring and its broken legacy, found themselves caught between the warmth of their divine origins and the cold grasp of a fate unbidden. They were born of the gods' most intimate desires, their bloodlines as powerful as they were tragic. Each one a reflection of a singular vision, yet bound together by their shared inheritance of the Elden Ring's immense power. Radagon, in his fervent need for control, had sown his legacy through the fertile lands of the lands between, planting the seeds of future conflict in the hearts of his offspring. His children, like the gods themselves, were born with the weight of the world upon their shoulders, their fates intertwined with the Elden Ring, a bond that would never be severed. Queen Marika, ever vigilant, gave birth to many of these demigods, each one imbued with a part of her eternal spirit. And yet, as the world shifted, As the Elden Ring fractured and shattered, these demigods found themselves no longer at peace with the destinies they were born into. The beauty of their divine creation was now tainted with the bitter taste of disillusionment and anger as they each sought their place in the broken world. Radon, the firstborn son of Radagon and Marika, stood as a towering figure, his presence as fierce as the winds that swept across the battlefield. Raised in the shadow of his father's power, Radon was a warrior through and through. His heart, though strong, felt the gnawing ache of a world that could never be whole again. Born with the strength of the stars themselves, he had been gifted with a great power, yet it was a power that would not save him from the sorrow of a world now divided. But it was not the battles Radhan fought that defined him. It was his sense of responsibility that burdened him. He knew that his father's broken legacy now rested upon his shoulders, and that he too would be called upon to carry the weight of the world. He looked upon the scattered lands, the remnants of the once unified world, and he understood that his role would not be one of simple conquest. It would be one of restoration, or at least an attempt to restore what had been lost. Then there was Millennia, the blade of Miquella, another offspring of Radagon and Marika. Her story was one marked by sorrow and sacrifice. She had been gifted with beauty and power, but it came at a great cost. Infected with the scarlet rot, a disease that slowly consumed her body and mind, Millennia had spent her life struggling against the inevitable decay that threatened to take her. Yet, in the face of her own mortality, Millennia found strength in her bond with her brother, Miquella. Miquella, the unalloyed, was her counterpart, a being of pure potential, untouched by the rot that plagued his sister. His heart, free from the corruption of the world, dreamed of a place where both he and Millennia could be free. He sought to create a world of healing and renewal, a land untouched by the scars of the Elden Ring's collapse. But even he, in his pursuit of perfection, could not escape the cruel hand of fate. His efforts were constantly undermined by the world's inescapable darkness, and he too began to question whether his dreams were worth the sacrifice. The other demigods, too, felt the weight of their parentage, each one burdened by the expectations placed upon them. Morgoth, the Omen King, was cursed from the very moment of his birth. Born with a body marked by the curse of the gods, he had been hidden away, his existence kept in the shadows of the world. His heart was full of resentment, and yet he carried the heavy responsibility of his lineage with a quiet dignity. Morgoth, though filled with anger, understood that he was part of something greater than himself. He too was tied to the Elden Ring, though his fate seemed darker than the others. Mog, his twin brother, had been abandoned to the depths of the earth. He had long since forsaken the bonds of family, choosing instead to align himself with the darker forces that sought to break the world apart. His path was one of chaos and corruption, a reflection of the very darkness that had seeped into the Elden Ring itself. Mog's ambition burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns, and he cared not for the struggles of the others, only for his own ascension. Yet even as they struggled with the weight of their power, each demigod was a reflection of something beautiful, something divine. They were the children of the gods, born from the deepest desires of the world. But they were also bound by the curse of their birth, their fates forever marked by the shattering of the Elden Ring. As the demigods moved through the world, Seeking their own paths, they found that their destinies were not their own to choose. The world had been broken, and in its brokenness, they were all left to find their place in the ruins. Some sought power, others sought redemption, but none could escape the lingering echoes of the Elden Ring's destruction. The bonds they shared with one another, once so strong, had now fractured, leaving each demigod to face their own fate alone. The demigods were not just the offspring of the gods, they were the children of a world that had been broken beyond repair. And yet, they carried within them the hope of something more, a chance to restore what had been lost, to rebuild what had been broken. Their journey, though filled with pain and sorrow, was also one of hope, a hope that even in the darkest of times, there was still a chance for something beautiful to grow. Radagon stood as a figure of both awe and sorrow, a being forged from the very essence of the Elden Ring's power. His golden armor gleamed with the radiance of 1,000 suns, each plate a testament to his strength, his duty, and his unyielding devotion to the world he sought to protect. Yet beneath that armor, there was a heart burdened by a deep, unspoken loneliness, a heart that sought freedom but could never truly attain it. Born from the union of Marika and the Elden Ring, Radagon was not simply a man, but an embodiment of a world that had been shaped by divine will. His rise to power was swift, and his reign over the lands between was marked by a golden age of prosperity. Under his rule, the world flourished, its people blessed with the bounty of the gods. Yet even in the midst of such peace, Radagon could not escape the weight of his inheritance. He had been chosen to lead, to bear the mantle of the Golden King, but it was a role that left him feeling more isolated than ever. The Elden Ring, the very heart of the world, had granted him unmatched power, but it had also made him a prisoner to the very laws that governed the world. He was bound to the ring, a servant to its will, and in his heart a quiet longing for release began to stir. It was in the quiet moments, the moments when the world seemed to sleep beneath the weight of its own creation, that Radagon allowed himself to wonder. Was there more to life than this? Could there be a world beyond the ring, a world where he was not bound by the chains of destiny? His mind, so sharp and calculating, began to entertain thoughts of rebellion, of breaking free from the world's hold, of forging a new path for himself. But the price of such thoughts was steep, for Radagon knew that to betray the very world that had shaped him was to betray his own existence. The Elden Ring had given him purpose, it had given him strength, but it had also taken from him the one thing that all gods desired, freedom. And so he remained bound, a prisoner to his own divine nature. His relationship with Queen Marika, too, was marked by both love and sorrow. Their union had brought forth great power, but it had also set in motion the events that would lead to the world's inevitable fall. Their bond, once one of passion and devotion, had become strained by the very responsibilities they shared. Marika, too, felt the weight of the world upon her shoulders, and though they had once stood united, their fates were now tied to the same tragic force that had broken the Elden Ring. Radagon's love for Marika was deep, but it was also complicated. He admired her strength, her wisdom, and her unyielding will. Yet he could not help but feel that she, too, was a prisoner, one bound by the same chains that held him. Together, they had ruled over the lands between, but they had done so at the cost of their own peace. And so, Radagon found himself torn between duty and desire, between the world he had been given and the world he longed to create. The fracture of the Elden Ring was the moment that would change everything. It was the moment that Radagon's dreams of freedom would either be realized or crushed forever. In his desperation, he turned to the very power that had once given him strength, seeking a way to break the bonds that had held him captive for so long. But even as he sought to change the world, Radagon was forced to confront the truth. The power he sought to control was no longer his to wield. In the end, it was the Elden Ring's own disintegration that marked Radagon's downfall. His desire for freedom, for release from the ring's grasp, had led him to shatter the very thing that had given the world its balance. The power he sought to claim had slipped from his grasp, and with it, the very foundation of the world itself began to crumble. The world that Radagon had fought so hard to protect was now spiraling into chaos, its once bright future now uncertain and dark. Radagon's story is one of contradiction, a tale of a man born to rule, yet forever bound by the weight of his own desires. He was a king, yes, but also a prisoner, a warrior, yet one who could never find peace. His legacy is marked by both greatness and tragedy, a reminder of the price that must be paid for the pursuit of freedom in a world that is built on the very chains of fate. And as the demigods began to rise, each one claiming their piece of the shattered Elden Ring, Radagon found himself standing at the crossroads of fate, unable to turn back. The world he had known was gone, and with it, the hope that had once burned brightly in his heart. Radagon, the Golden King, was now a mere shadow of his former self, his dreams of freedom lost in the ruins of a broken world. In the end, Radagon's greatest tragedy was not his fall from grace, but the realization that he had never truly been free, bound by the very power that had given him his strength. Radagon had sought a world beyond the Elden Ring, but in doing so, he had doomed himself to a fate more tragic than any king could endure. The Elden Ring, once a symbol of hope and unity, had become the chains that bound the demigods and the world together in eternal strife. Queen Marika, the Eternal, stood as the heart of the lands between, a figure of immense grace and quiet authority. Her presence, like the steady pull of the moon, was constant, guiding the world through the ebb and flow of time. Yet beneath that serene surface, there was a turmoil, a quiet ache that whispered of a world that had grown heavy and a duty that had begun to feel like a burden. Marika's reign was one of both strength and sorrow. She had given birth to the world, and she had given birth to the demigods. She had woven the very fabric of existence into the pattern of her own desires. And yet, as the years passed, the weight of that power began to wear upon her. The world that she had created and the Elden Ring she had once held so close had started to slip through her fingers, leaving behind only traces of its former glory. Her bond with Radagon, her partner in both life and duty, had once been the foundation upon which the world stood. Together, they had forged the future, their fates intertwined in a dance of creation and destruction. But even their love, which had once been a shining beacon in the darkness, had begun to wane. Radagon's growing restlessness had driven a wedge between them, and the Elden Ring's fracture only deepened that divide. Their relationship, once a source of strength, had become a symbol of the world's crumbling unity. Marika's heart was heavy with the knowledge that the world she had forged was now in danger of falling apart. The Elden Ring, once the source of all order and balance, was no longer whole. Its shards were scattered, its power fractured, and with it, the very world she had worked so hard to build seemed to be slipping away. It was as though the threads that had once bound the world together were now unraveling, and she could do nothing to stop it. But it was not just the Elden Ring that weighed upon Marika's heart. It was the fate of her children, each demigod, each one a reflection of her own soul, was now caught in the web of their own desires, each struggling with the same burden that she herself had once carried. They were her legacy, and yet they were also the cause of the world's descent into chaos. The shattering, which had once been a distant, abstract concept, was now an inescapable reality. The world was changing, and with it, her place in it. Marika's pain was not just the sorrow of a queen watching her kingdom crumble. It was the sorrow of a mother watching her children, once so full of potential, now caught in a cycle of destruction and division. She had given them life, but she could not give them peace. Her love for them was fierce, but it was also tinged with regret. She had wanted more for them, more than the world had given her. But the world she had created was no longer enough to sustain them, and so they sought more, more power, more freedom, more control. And in their search, they had shattered everything. Her love for Radagon, too, had been tested. Once, they had shared a bond that transcended time, a love that was both sacred and eternal. But that bond had begun to unravel, just as the world had. Radagon's growing restlessness, his desire for freedom, had pulled him away from her, leaving her to face the disintegration of their shared vision alone. The two of them, once so unified in their purpose, were now divided, their fates pulled in opposite directions. Marika, in her quiet solitude, found herself questioning everything. Had she made the right choices? Had she been too focused on preserving the world, too focused on holding the pieces of the Elden Ring together, that she had failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface? Was her love for her children and her husband enough to heal the wounds that now threatened to tear them all apart? In the quiet of the night, she would stand alone in the vast halls of the golden capital, looking out over the lands between. The stars twinkled faintly in the sky, and the winds whispered through the trees, carrying with them the scent of a world on the brink of change. She would close her eyes, listening to the soft murmurs of the world around her, and for a moment she would feel the weight of time pressing upon her heart. But even in the face of all that had been lost, there was still a part of her that refused to surrender. She was Marika, the eternal, daughter of the gods, mother of demigods, queen of a world that had once known peace. And though the Elden Ring had shattered, and though her kingdom was crumbling, she would not allow herself to be consumed by despair. She would fight to the end, for her children, for the world, and for herself. Her path was not one of easy answers or quick solutions. It was a path of quiet reflection, of soul searching, and of painful choices. But through it all, she remained steadfast, a queen who had known both love and loss, a mother who had given everything for the future of her children, and a ruler who could never quite escape the shadow of her own creation. Marika's story was one of eternal struggle, between love and duty, between creation and destruction, between the desire for peace and the inevitability of chaos. And though the world she had built was breaking apart, there was still a part of her that clung to the hope that something beautiful could rise from the ashes. For even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of rebirth. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, stood as a figure of stoic grandeur, a man whose life had been woven into the very fabric of the lands between. His presence was that of an unyielding force, a pillar of strength whose gaze could silence even the most restless of souls. Yet beneath the surface of his resolute exterior, there lay a heart weighed down by regret, by the unrelenting passage of time, and by the choices he had made in the name of duty. Born to serve, Godfrey had known little else than the call of battle, the hunger for victory, and the need to protect the world that he had sworn to uphold. His strength was unmatched, his resolve unbroken. Yet it was this very strength that had led him down a path of isolation, a path that would ultimately lead to the fall of the world he had worked so hard to protect. The Elden Ring, once a symbol of unity and order, had bound Godfrey to the very land he sought to protect. As the first Elden Lord, he had been the figurehead of the golden lineage, the protector of the world's stability. But this stability was an illusion, a fragile construct held together by the weight of the Elden Ring's power. And as the world began to crumble, as the shattering of the Elden Ring tore the very fabric of reality, Godfrey found himself caught between the desire to protect and the realization that perhaps there was nothing left to save. In the early days of his rule, Godfrey had been a beacon of hope. His strength and courage had inspired those around him, and he had led his people through countless battles with a fierce determination. His hands, calloused by years of war, had held the world together, and he had done so with a quiet dignity. Yet as the years wore on, Godfrey began to sense that the world he had fought for was slipping away. The cracks in the Elden Ring, once imperceptible, had begun to widen, and with each passing day, the world seemed more and more distant from the one he had known. His relationship with Marika had been one of mutual respect, a partnership forged in the fires of their shared duty. Together, they had ruled the lands between, their bond unshakable. Yet even as they stood side by side, they could not escape the weight of the world's burden. Marika, with her eternal grace, had been the heart of the world, while Godfrey had been its sword. But the sword, no matter how sharp, could not protect a world that was slowly breaking apart. As the Elden Ring began to shatter, Godfrey found himself facing a cruel truth. The world he had fought so hard to protect was no longer the world he had known. The people he had once led, the lands he had once defended, were now caught in the chaos of a broken reality. The Elden Ring had lost its power, and with it, Godfrey's sense of purpose. It was in this moment of disillusionment that Godfrey made the decision that would change everything. He chose to relinquish his title as Elden Lord, to step away from the throne that had defined his existence for so long. The weight of his responsibilities had become too much to bear, and he could no longer stand at the head of a crumbling world. His departure was not one of abandonment, but of acceptance that the world, like him, was no longer whole. But even as he stepped away, Godfrey could not escape the pull of his past. The Elden Ring, even in its fractured state, still called to him. It was the thread that had tied him to the world, the thing that had given his life meaning. And now, as the world spiraled into chaos, he found himself drawn back into its grasp. In his quiet moments, Godfrey would reflect on the choices he had made. He had fought for the world, But had it been worth the cost? The lives he had taken, the sacrifices he had made, had they truly served the greater good? Or had they only fueled the endless cycle of pain and destruction that now threatened to consume everything? Godfrey's departure from the throne was not a retreat, but a recognition of the need for change. The world, as it was, could no longer be saved. The Elden Ring, once the source of order and balance, had fractured, and with it, the world had begun to unravel. But in that unraveling, there was also the possibility of rebirth, a chance to rebuild, to forge a new path from the ruins of the old. And so, Godfrey wandered the lands, a man without a crown, a king without a kingdom. His strength remained, but it was no longer the strength of a ruler. It was the strength of a man who had seen the world for what it truly was. In his heart, there remained a flicker of hope, a belief that even in the darkest of times, there could be a way forward. He had given everything for the world, and now, in its broken state, he was left to find a new purpose. Godfrey's story is one of sacrifice and redemption, of a man who gave everything for the world he loved, only to watch it fall apart. It is a tale of strength and weakness, of honor and regret, of a king who was bound to his duty, but ultimately had to let go of the world he had once ruled. And in the end, it is a story of acceptance that sometimes even the strongest of us must bow to the forces beyond our control. As Godfrey walked the shattered lands, his steps carried the weight of 1,000 battles, 1,000 regrets, and 1,000 hopes for a future yet to be written. The Elden Ring, once a symbol of power and order, had shattered, and with it, the world had been thrown into chaos. But even in the face of that chaos, Godfrey stood tall, a silent reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of redemption. Morgott and Mog, twin demigods born of the shattered Elden Ring, stood as two halves of a tragic whole, their fates forever linked by the blood that flowed through their veins. Their story was one of division, of two souls torn apart by the very curse that had marked their existence. Though they shared the same origin, their paths diverged, shaped by the world's cruelty and their own inner turmoil. Morgott, the Omen King, had always carried the burden of his curse. From the moment of his birth, he had been marked as an abomination, a creature whose very existence was deemed unnatural by the gods. He was a reflection of the world's fractured nature, a being born not of pure light, but of the shadow cast by the Elden Ring's fracture. His body, twisted and scarred by the curse, was a constant reminder of the world's imperfections, and it was a reminder that even those born of divine blood could be cast aside. For Morgott, the world had never been kind. He had been hidden away, kept in the shadows of the lands between, his true identity a secret to all but the gods. His existence had been one of silence, of solitude, as he was forced to live in the shadow of his more perfect siblings. The other demigods, born of the same divine union, were revered and adored, their power a symbol of the world's greatness. But Morgott was different. His very being was a mark of shame, a reflection of the world's inability to fully create what it had intended, and so he was cast aside, left to struggle with the weight of his own existence. But despite the weight of his curse, Morgott never lost his sense of purpose. He had been abandoned, yes, but that did not mean he had been forgotten. In the silence of his solitude, he had come to understand the world in a way that few others could. He knew the pain of being cast aside, of being ignored, but he also knew the strength that could be found in that very pain. His curse had not broken him, it had forged him into something stronger, something more determined. Morgoth's story was one of survival, of finding a place in a world that had no room for him. He had fought for his place, carved out his own destiny, and though the world may have rejected him, he had never stopped striving to be something more. His power, though born from the shadows, was immense, and it was a power that he had earned through years of struggle and isolation. But then there was Mog, his twin brother, who had taken a different path. While Morgoth had fought to survive, Mog had embraced the darkness, seeking power through chaos and corruption. Unlike his brother, Mog had not been content to live in the shadows. He had sought to bring that darkness into the light, to embrace the chaos that had torn the Elden Ring apart. Mog's path was one of ambition and destruction. He had cast aside the restraints of his bloodline, choosing instead to align himself with the forces that sought to break the world apart. He was a demigod, born of the same divine union as Morgoth. But where Morgoth had fought to preserve the world, Mog had sought to tear it down. His ambitions were not guided by a desire for peace or order, but by a lust for power, for control over the shattered remnants of the Elden Ring. And so, Mog had descended into the depths of the earth, forsaking his heritage and his family in favor of the darkness that had claimed his heart. His power was not one of creation, but one of destruction. He had become a symbol of the very chaos that had shattered the world, a reflection of the forces that sought to unmake all that had been built. His actions were not those of a ruler or a protector, but of a tyrant, one who sought to impose his will upon a broken world, to reshape it in his own image. But even as Mog sought to bend the world to his will, there was a part of him that remained tethered to his brother, Morgoth. Despite their differences, despite the paths they had taken, they were still twins, still bound by the same blood. And in that blood, there was a shared history, a shared understanding of what it meant to be born into a world that had no place for them. Morgoth and Mog were two sides of the same coin, one seeking redemption through survival, the other through destruction. Their rivalry was not just a battle for power, it was a battle for identity. Morgoth had spent his life fighting for a place in a world that had rejected him, while Mog had sought to destroy that world in order to create a new one where he could rule without restraint. But in the end, neither of them could escape the truth. The world they had known was gone, and their fates, like the Elden Ring itself, were fractured beyond repair. In their hearts, both Morgoth and Mog knew that they could never truly be free. They were bound to the same broken world, the same shattered legacy. And yet, despite the darkness that had claimed them both, there was still a flicker of hope, a hope that perhaps, through their struggle, they could find a way to reshape the world, to rebuild what had been lost. But as the world around them crumbled and the Elden Ring lay shattered, Morgoth and Mog found themselves locked in a struggle that neither could win. Their paths were set, their fates sealed. The world was broken, and they, like the world, would never be the same again. Rani, the Witch of the Full Moon, was a figure both enigmatic and captivating, her very being intertwined with the stars themselves. Her story, like the moon's phases, was one of hidden truths, quiet rebellions, and a longing for freedom that could not be contained. In the lands of the Elden Ring, where gods and demigods were born of divine will, Rani sought something different, a future shaped by her own desires, untethered from the constraints of the gods' plans. Born of the sacred union between Radagon and Marika, Rani was no ordinary demigod. She was different from her siblings, a child who refused to accept the world as it was handed to her. While others sought power or dominion over the broken remnants of the Elden Ring, Rani sought something deeper, something that could free her from the limitations of her divine birth. She was born under the light of the full moon, and it was under this very light that she would come to understand the true nature of her fate. Rani's rebellion was not one of violence or conquest, but one of quiet defiance. She was a master of magic, a witch whose power was drawn from the very stars that twinkled in the night sky. Her magic was not the force of destruction that some of her siblings wielded, but rather a force of transformation, of change. It was a power that sought to remake the world, to alter the course of fate itself, and to do so in a way that would free her from the chains that bound her to the gods. But Rani's rebellion was not without cost. The world she sought to create was one that would no longer be governed by the will of the Elden Ring, nor would it be shaped by the gods who had created it. She had come to realize that the very foundation of the world was flawed, that the balance that had once held the world together was now nothing more than a lie. And so, in her search for freedom, Rani set out to break the world's bonds, to unshackle herself from the fate that had been written for her since her birth. Her path was not one of simple escape, but of great sacrifice. Rani's desire for freedom came at a steep price, the price of the Elden Ring itself. She would shatter the world's delicate balance, disrupt the very force that had held it all together, in order to create something new, something truly her own. In doing so, she would bring about a new age, an age where the gods no longer ruled over the lives of mortals, and where the demigods could no longer claim dominion over the world. But in her quest to break the chains of her birth, Rani was not alone. She had allies, those who shared her vision of a world beyond the control of the gods. There was Blade, the half-wolf warrior who had sworn to protect her, and Nokron, the city of eternal night, where Rani would make her stand. These allies, though bound to her by loyalty, were also drawn to her by the same desire for freedom, the same yearning to break free from the shackles of a world that had long been broken. And yet, even as Rani's power grew, so too did the realization that freedom came at a cost. The path she had chosen would not be an easy one, and it would not come without consequence. The world she sought to create, the new order she wished to establish, was not one that could be easily achieved. There were those who stood against her, who sought to preserve the old order, to maintain the balance that had been established by the Elden Ring. The demigods, each with their own ambitions and desires, would not easily relinquish the power they had inherited. Radon, the warrior king, Millennia, the blade of Miquella, and even her own siblings, like Godfrey and Morgott, would not simply step aside and allow Rani to remake the world in her image. They were bound to the Elden Ring, just as she was, and they too felt the weight of their birthright. In the quiet moments, when the night stretched long and the moon cast its pale light over the world, Rani would pause and reflect on the cost of her rebellion. Was it worth it? Was the freedom she sought truly worth the sacrifice, the upheaval, and the inevitable confrontation with the gods themselves? She did not know. What she did know, however, was that she could no longer live in the world that had been created for her. She could no longer remain passive, accepting the fate that had been written for her before she even drew breath. And so, under the full moon's watchful gaze, Rani made her choice. She would shatter the Elden Ring's bonds, release the world from the tyranny of the gods, and reshape the future. It was not a path of easy answers or simple victories, but it was a path that led to freedom. It was a path that would take her through darkness and light, through loss and discovery, but it was a path she had to walk. She could not, would not remain silent any longer. Her rebellion, though quiet and subtle, would ripple through the world like the first crack of thunder before a storm. And as the winds of change began to blow, Rani stood at the precipice of a new dawn, her heart filled with both fear and hope. She had chosen her path, and now she would see it through, no matter the cost. For Rani, the witch of the full moon, the journey had just begun. The world she sought to create would not come easily, but it was a world of her own making, one that would no longer be defined by the gods who had sought to control it. Radon, the Star Scourge, was a man of immense might and tragic grandeur. His very name echoed through the lands between like a thunderclap that resonated across the heavens. He was the firstborn of Radagon and Marika, a demigod whose strength was unparalleled. His fame spread far and wide as a mighty warrior who battled against the heavens themselves. Yet despite the power he commanded, Radon's story was not one of conquest or glory, but of sorrow and sacrifice. Born under the banner of the Elden Ring, Radon's life had been shaped by both divine will and his own indomitable spirit. As the eldest of the demigods, he was expected to lead, to protect the world from threats both internal and external. His strength was unrivaled, his power so great that he could hold back the stars themselves. He was a force of nature, a warrior whose very presence inspired both awe and fear. And yet, for all his strength, Radahan was not immune to the world's inevitable decay. The world he had sworn to protect was crumbling, its foundations eroded by the very forces he had fought to defend. The Elden Ring's fracture had torn the world asunder, and Radon, like the other demigods, was left to pick up the pieces. But unlike his siblings, Radon's battle was not one fought with swords or spells. It was a battle fought within, a struggle against the darkness that had begun to consume him from within. The Star Scourge was not just a title, it was a reflection of the inner turmoil that had taken root in Radon's heart. In his youth, he had fought with vigor, with purpose. His battles had been legendary, each one a testament to his unyielding will. But as the world around him began to fall apart, Radhain found himself drawn into an internal struggle, one that no amount of strength could overcome. The curse of the Star Scourge, a dark and malevolent force, slowly began to consume him. It was a curse that left Radon battling not only his enemies, but the very stars themselves. The curse caused his body to weaken, his strength to falter, and his mind to wander. It was as if the very heavens had turned against him, and in the quiet moments, Radon would look to the stars above, as if searching for answers. But all he found was emptiness. His body, once a symbol of power, was now a prison. The very thing that had made him invincible was now the thing that kept him bound. The curse of the Star Scourge had taken hold of him, and with it, Radon's fate seemed sealed. The warrior who had once stood at the forefront of battles now found himself alone, fighting not only the enemies before him, but the enemy within. In his isolation, Radon came to a painful realization. The power that had once been his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. The battle he fought against the curse of the Star Scourge was not one that could be won with the strength of his arm or the power of his mind. It was a battle of will, of acceptance, and of the slow unraveling of the very essence of who he was. But even in his despair, Radon's heart remained steadfast. He had never been one to give in to defeat, to surrender to fate. His strength was not just in his body, but in his heart, and though his body betrayed him, his spirit remained unbroken. Radhan knew that his fate was no longer in his hands, that the curse of the Star Scourge had already set its course. But in the final moments of his life, Radhan did what he had always done. He fought. He fought not for glory, not for power, but for the honor of those who had stood by his side, for the people he had sworn to protect. Even as his body weakened and the curse spread, Radhan stood tall, a figure of defiance against the encroaching darkness. He would not go quietly into the night. The warrior who had once stood against the heavens now stood against his own demise, a last act of defiance in a world that had forsaken him. Radhan's final battle was not one of strength, but of endurance. His body, ravaged by the curse, could no longer hold the weight of his power, but his spirit, his will to fight, remained unbroken. And as the stars above him flickered in the distance, Radhan made his final stand, not as a warrior, but as a man who had faced the darkness and refused to be consumed by it. His death, though inevitable, was not a failure. Radhan had given everything for the world, and in the end, he had fought not for victory, but for something far more important, for the hope that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there could still be light. The stars may have fallen, but Radhan had burned brightly until the very end. The story of Radhan, the Star Scourge, is one of power and tragedy, of a man who fought not only the battles before him, but the battle within. His legacy is one of defiance, of a warrior who stood tall in the face of defeat, who gave everything for the world he loved. Though he may have fallen, his spirit, his will, lives on in the hearts of those who remember him. Melania, the blade of Michaela, was a figure of both sorrow and beauty, her very existence marked by the weight of both divine blood and an unrelenting curse. Her story, like the wind that whispered through the lands of the Elden Ring, was one of conflict and struggle, a tale of resilience in the face of unimaginable suffering. She was a warrior, yes, but her true battle was not with any foe in the traditional sense. Millennia's true enemy was the Scarlet Rot, a curse that clung to her like a shadow, a force of nature that threatened to devour her from within. Born as the daughter of Radagon and Marika, Millennia was a demigod like her siblings, but her life was defined not by her power or her birthright, but by the battle she fought against the inevitable decay of her body. The Scarlet Rot, a malignant and insidious force, had taken root in her from the moment of her birth. It was a disease that corrupted both the mind and the body, slowly spreading, relentlessly gnawing at her very being. It was the price of her existence, a gift that came with the divine blood coursing through her veins. But it was a gift she would never have asked for. From the very beginning, Millennia's life had been one of isolation and struggle. While her siblings took to the world with strength and ambition, she had been bound to a constant battle against the rot. It consumed her body, turning her once glistening form into something twisted and fragile. Her beauty, once radiant like the stars, was now marred by the sickly green hue of the disease that ravaged her. And yet, through it all, Millennia never wavered. She never let the disease define her. She fought always with the heart of a lion, her strength unmatched by any foe. But as much as she fought, Millennia knew that the battle was one she could never truly win. The scarlet rot was a curse that could never be fully purged. It was a part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her being. There were moments when she would look into the mirror and see the reflection of the person she once was before the rot had taken hold. And in those moments, she would mourn the life she had lost, the life she had been destined for, but could never have. Her bond with her brother, Michaela, was the only source of solace in her life. Michaela, the unalloyed, was a figure of purity and light, the very opposite of Millennia. Where she was consumed by decay, he was untouched by the world's corruption. Where she fought to survive, he dreamed of healing, of creating a world free of suffering. He was the only one who truly understood her pain, the only one who saw her not as the blade of Michaela, the warrior, but as Millennia, his sister, the one who had been given the cruelest of fates. In her heart, Millennia knew that Michaela was the one true light in her life, the one thing that gave her the strength to keep fighting. It was for him that she endured the pain of the rot, for him that she carried on despite the odds. She had promised him that she would protect him, that she would never falter, never surrender to the disease that slowly consumed her. And so, with every step she took, every battle she fought, Millennia held her promise close, knowing that the only thing that truly mattered was her brother's safety. But even as she fought with all her might, Millennia could not escape the creeping inevitability of her fate. The rot was relentless, and though she was a warrior of unmatched skill, she was still bound by the curse that had been bestowed upon her. She had once dreamed of a life free from the disease, of a future where she could be whole, but as the days passed, those dreams seemed farther and farther out of reach. The world around her began to change, and with it, her body, once a vessel of beauty and strength, began to betray her. In the midst of this struggle, Millennia's power as a warrior only grew. Despite the rot, she became known as the Blade of Michaela, a symbol of both strength and suffering. Her very presence on the battlefield was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned warriors. She was a force to be reckoned with, her blade cutting through the air with a grace that belied the pain she carried within her. Her enemies fell before her, and yet as she struck them down, she knew that with each victory came a cost, her own body deteriorating further. But Millennia was not one to be easily defeated. Even as the rot ravaged her, she remained steadfast, her heart unyielding. She fought not for glory or fame, but for something deeper, something more personal. She fought for the chance to be free, for the chance to be whole once more, even if she knew that such a freedom was an impossible dream. She fought because she had no other choice, because to stop fighting would be to surrender to the disease that had already claimed so much of her. In her moments of solitude, Millennia would find herself reflecting on the life she had lost, the future that had been stolen from her. She would think of her brother, Michaela, and the world he had dreamed of, a world free from pain, free from the scars of the past. She would think of the world they had once known, a world that had been shattered by the fracture of the Elden Ring. And in those quiet moments, she would wonder if there was still hope for a future where the rot no longer ruled her. Millennia's journey was one of both courage and despair, of a warrior who fought not just for survival, but for redemption. She knew that the world around her was broken, that the Elden Ring's fracture had set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of history. But in her heart, there remained the faintest spark of hope, a hope that, through her struggle, she might one day find peace, and that Michaela, the unalloyed, was a figure both pure and sorrowful, a demigod whose life was defined by a single, unwavering desire to free the world from suffering. Unlike his siblings, whose fates were marked by the struggles of power, war, and inheritance, Michaela's life was driven by a deep, almost innocent yearning for healing and restoration. Born from the divine union of Radagon and Marika, he was a child of the gods, yet he was marked by a singular purpose that set him apart: to cure the world's ills, to erase its pain, and to mend what had been broken by the shattering of the Elden Ring. From the moment of his birth, Michaela was different. While the other demigods had inherited the power of the Elden Ring, their strength was often tied to war and domination. But Michaela's gift was one of restoration, a gift that had made him both revered and misunderstood, sought not to conquer, but to heal. He did not want the power of the gods or the dominion over the world, but rather the power to change it, to turn it back from the brink of destruction and bring peace to the hearts of those who lived in torment. However, as the world around him continued to break, Michaela found himself trapped in the same cycle of suffering that had claimed so many others. His gift of healing was not enough to stop the rot that had begun to spread throughout the lands between. The world's decay was an unstoppable force, one that could not be cured by even the purest of hearts. Michaela, for all his power and wisdom, could do little more than watch as the world he had hoped to save continued to fall apart. But Michaela's tragedy was not just in his inability to heal the world, it was in the curse of his own existence. Unlike his siblings, who were marked by strength, power, and the legacy of their bloodlines, Michaela was marked by something more fragile: his youth, his innocence, and his vulnerability. In his quest for healing, he had become the very thing he sought to cure. His own body was not free from the curse of the Elden Ring. It too was fractured, its purity corrupted by the world's pain and suffering. He was not the unblemished figure that others saw him to be. His body, untouched by the chaos of the world, held within it the fragility of a broken dream. This fragility weighed heavily on Michaela's heart. His desire to heal the world was matched only by his desire to cure himself. But how could he heal the world when he could not heal himself? How could he bring peace to others when his own body was a reflection of the world's corruption? The question haunted him, gnawed at his soul, and in the silence of the night, when the stars twinkled dimly above him, Michaela would often wonder if his gift, so pure and so powerful, was truly a blessing or a curse. In his quiet moments, Michaela would think of his sister, Millennia, the blade of Michaela, his constant companion in both life and death. Their bond was a sacred one, forged in the fires of their shared suffering. While Miquella had always sought to heal the world, millennia had fought against the curse that consumed her, her strength unmatched even in the face of the rot. She was his closest ally, his protector, and his hope. But as the years passed and the world continued to unravel, Miquella saw the toll that the curse had taken on her. Her body, ravaged by the rot, was a constant reminder that even the greatest warriors could not escape the world's decay. Miquella's love for Millennia was deep, but it was also tinged with guilt. He had promised her that he would find a way to cure the rot, that he would make her whole again. Yet, as he looked upon her, he knew that the world was beyond his reach, beyond his ability to heal. His dreams of a perfect world, a world where no one suffered, had crumbled along with the Elden Ring. The world he had sought to save was beyond repair, and in that realization, Miquella felt the weight of his own inadequacy. But even in the face of such despair, Miquella did not give up. He could not. His purpose was clear: to heal, to restore, to rebuild. And so, he pressed forward, even as the world around him continued to fall apart. He sought out the sacred places of the world, the hidden corners where the Elden Ring's power still lingered, and there he hoped to find the key to his salvation and the world's. Yet despite his efforts, the cure remained elusive. His journey, though filled with promise, seemed to lead him in circles, each step bringing him no closer to the goal he so desperately sought. Miquella's story is one of profound tragedy, a tale of a demigod whose heart was filled with love, but whose body was marked by the corruption of the world. His quest to heal, to restore what had been lost, was both noble and futile. And yet, even in the face of this futility, Miquella pressed on, refusing to accept that the world he had dreamed of was forever beyond his reach. Perhaps it was this refusal to surrender that made Miquella so tragic. He could not accept the idea that the world was beyond redemption, that the Elden Ring's fracture had caused irreparable damage. But in his heart, he knew that his journey was not one of complete failure. Though he could not heal the world, though he could not cure the pain that plagued it, Miquella had given the world something far more precious than his healing touch. He had given it hope. And in the darkness that had settled over the lands between, hope was a light that could never be extinguished. Miquella, the unalloyed, would remain a symbol of what could have been, a figure of purity in a world marked by decay. His journey was not one of triumph, but of quiet endurance, of a demigod who sought to heal not just the world, but himself. And though the world would continue to break, his spirit, his gift of healing, would remain, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always the possibility of light. Godwyn, the Golden Prince, was a figure of noble birth and tragic fate. As the firstborn son of Queen Marika and Radagon, his life was destined to be one of greatness. He was revered by all, a symbol of the world's enduring light in the face of encroaching darkness. His beauty was unmatched, his strength unquestioned, and his soul seemed as pure as the very light of the stars. Yet for all his grandeur, Godwyn's fate was not one of glory. It was a fate marked by sacrifice and sorrow, one that would leave him forever bound to the Elden Ring's fractured world. From the moment of his birth, Godwyn was destined to be the heir to the Elden Ring's power. As the firstborn of Radagon and Marika, he was the chosen successor to the throne of the Golden Lineage. His future seemed assured, his path clear. He would rule over the lands between as a king of unimaginable power, a king who would restore the Elden Ring to its rightful place. But even the most radiant of destinies can be shattered, and Godwin's path, though paved with promise, would lead him to a tragic and irreversible end. Godwin's life was defined by a love for his people and his land. He was a protector, a guardian of the realm, whose strength and wisdom were both a blessing and a burden. He loved his people deeply, and they, in turn, revered him as their prince. But it was not just his love for them that defined his character. It was his commitment to the Elden Ring's ideals. He believed in the balance it offered, the harmony it brought to the world, and he sought to preserve it at all costs. Yet the very power that had given the world its structure was also the power that had begun to unravel it. The fracture of the Elden Ring had caused a rift in the world, one that could not be healed by even the mightiest of demigods. As the world began to crumble, Godwin found himself torn between duty and despair. He had sworn to protect the world, but how could he protect it when its very foundation was broken? His faith in the Elden Ring's power had been unwavering, but even he could see that the world he had known was slipping away. Godwin's most defining moment came when the Elden Ring shattered, and his father, Radagon, and mother, Marika, were torn apart by their respective desires. The power that had once held the world together was now a distant memory, and in its place, chaos reigned. The demigods who had once stood united under the ring's power were now scattered, each one vying for control of the fractured world. In the midst of this turmoil, Godwin knew that he could no longer stand by and watch as the world he had fought to protect descended into ruin. His heart heavy with the weight of his responsibilities, Godwin made the ultimate sacrifice. He chose to give his life for the world he loved, offering himself as the vessel for the world's pain. The sacrifice was not one of glory or honor. It was a silent, sorrowful act of love. Godwin understood that the world could not be saved by force or by power. It could only be saved by sacrifice. And so, in his final moments, he gave himself to the Elden Ring, offering his body as the anchor to hold the world together, to hold it in place as it teetered on the brink of destruction. Godwin's death, though tragic, was not in vain. His sacrifice, though unseen by most, was a reminder of the power of selflessness, of the strength that comes from putting others before oneself. His spirit, though torn from the world, remained within the very fabric of the land, a lingering presence that could never truly fade. His legacy, though marked by sorrow, was also one of hope. Hope that even in the darkest of times, there could still be light, still be love, still be a chance for redemption. But Godwin's sacrifice did not go unnoticed. The power he had given to the world had come at a cost, and that cost was paid not just by him, but by all who had loved him. The world, though held together by his spirit, continued to unravel. The demigods, each with their own ambitions and desires, sought to claim the power that had once been the Elden Rings. And in their quest for power, they tore the world further apart, leaving behind only the remnants of a broken dream. Godwin's legacy was one of both triumph and tragedy. He had given everything for the world, but in doing so, he had become a symbol of the very pain he had fought to erase. His life, though short, had been one of profound meaning, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the enduring strength of the human spirit. But even as the world continued to spiral into chaos, Godwin's spirit remained a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always a chance for something beautiful to rise from the ashes. In the end, Godwin was not remembered for the power he wielded, but for the love he gave. His legacy was not one of domination or conquest, but of quiet, enduring sacrifice. And though the world he had once known was gone, his memory would live on forever, a light that would never fade, even in the darkest of nights. In the shattered world of the lands between, where the Elden Ring's fracture had sent ripples of chaos across the realm, a dark and forbidden power stirred in the deepest shadows. The Three Fingers, mysterious, enigmatic, and dangerous, represented the chaotic force that sought to unravel the very fabric of the world. Their influence was subtle, creeping into the hearts of the vulnerable, sowing the seeds of destruction where once there had been balance. The Three Fingers were not like the demigods who walked in the light of the Elden Ring's power, nor were they creatures bound by the divine laws that governed the world. They were something else, something older, something darker. They were embodiments of a primal force, a chaotic energy that sought to destroy the world's order and replace it with something far more insidious. Their influence had spread quietly, unnoticed by many, yet it had infected the world like a slow burning fire. Those who felt the pull of the Three Fingers were not drawn by their power in the same way that the demigods had been drawn to the Elden Ring. No, the Three Fingers offered something far different, an escape from the pain of existence, an end to the suffering that had plagued the world since the shattering. They whispered to those who had been lost, those who had been forgotten, offering them a chance to free themselves from the weight of their divine inheritance. It was a tempting offer, one that promised freedom from the bonds that had tied the demigods to the broken world. But freedom, as the Three Fingers knew, came at a cost. The power they offered was not one of salvation, but one of ruin. Those who accepted their influence found themselves bound to the very force that sought to undo the world they had once known. The Three Fingers did not seek to rebuild. They sought to destroy, to burn the old world to the ground and create something new from the ashes. In the deepest corners of the lands between, those who had been seduced by the Three Fingers' whispers were changed, their minds twisted, their bodies corrupted, and their hearts consumed by the flame of chaos. These followers became known as the Finger Maidens, and their purpose was simple: to bring about the end of the world as it had been known. They were agents of the Three Fingers' will, their loyalty forged in the fires of destruction. The Finger Maidens were not the only ones to fall under the influence of the Three Fingers. Their reach extended far beyond the hidden corners of the world, touching even the most powerful of the demigods. Morgott, the Omen King, once a figure of sorrow and isolation, found himself drawn to the dark power of the Three Fingers. His heart, heavy with grief, sought a way to escape the pain of his cursed existence. The Three Fingers promised him release from the bonds that had bound him for so long, and he too was seduced by their whispers. Morgott, once a man of quiet dignity, was transformed by the influence of the Three Fingers. His body, already scarred by the curse of the Elden Ring, became even more grotesque, his mind twisted by the darkness that had consumed him. He became an instrument of the Three Fingers, a tool for their plan to destroy the world. His once noble heart had become a vessel for the very chaos that had ravaged the land. The influence of the Three Fingers was not confined to Morgoth alone. As the demigods struggled to find their place in a world that had been torn asunder, some saw in the Three Fingers' call an answer to their own suffering. They too sought to embrace the chaos, to cast aside the bonds of their divine inheritance and take control of their own fate. But with every step toward the Three Fingers came a step further into darkness. The world that the demigods had once known, the world that had been defined by the Elden Ring's power, was now a shattered remnant of its former self, and the Three Fingers sought nothing less than the complete destruction of that world, the undoing of all that had been created. The world was already in a state of ruin, but the Three Fingers did not see this as a tragedy. They saw it as an opportunity. The Elden Ring's fracture had already broken the world, and the Three Fingers sought to finish the job. They would burn the world to the ground, and in the ashes, they would create something new, a world without the constraints of order, a world ruled by chaos and destruction. Those who resisted the influence of the Three Fingers found themselves standing against an overwhelming tide. The power they sought to wield was unlike anything the world had ever known. It was a force of pure, unbridled chaos, and those who sought to control it would find themselves consumed by it. And yet, despite that overwhelming darkness that threatened to engulf the world, there was still a glimmer of hope. There were those who resisted the Three Fingers, who fought against the seductive whispers of chaos. They were the last remnants of a world that had once known peace, and though they were few, their strength was unwavering. They knew that the world could still be saved, that there was still a chance to rebuild what had been lost. But to do so, they would have to face the Three Fingers and the ruinous force they represented. The influence of the Three Fingers was not just a physical threat, it was a spiritual one, a force that sought to corrupt the very souls of those it touched. It preyed on the weakest parts of the heart, the deepest fears and desires, and it twisted them into something unrecognizable. Those who fell under its sway were not just changed, they were consumed, and the world, as they knew it, would never be the same again. In the wake of the shattering, when the Elden Ring's power fractured and the world fell into chaos, there arose a figure from the shadows of history, one not born of divine blood or divine ambition, but one whose spirit burned with a fire unlike any other. The Tarnished, as they were called, were those who had once been forsaken by the gods, cast aside, forgotten. Yet as the world crumbled around them, the Tarnished began to rise, answering a call that resonated deep within their souls. Unlike the demigods, whose bloodlines were tied to the divine, the Tarnished were mere mortals, mortals who had once been exiled from the lands that now lay broken and empty. They were not born of noble birth, nor did they wield the power of the Elden Ring. And yet, it was they who would become the world's last hope, for they were the only ones who still held the courage to stand against the demigods, to challenge the broken order that had once ruled the world. The Tarnished were drawn to the lands between, not by the promise of power or wealth, but by a singular purpose, to restore what had been lost. The gods had abandoned them, and the world had forsaken them, but the Tarnished still carried with them the weight of a lost legacy, a yearning to reclaim their place in a world that had forgotten them. The call of the Elden Ring was a call to those who were willing to defy fate itself, to challenge the goat and their twisted creations. The demigods, born of the gods' divine power, had long ruled the lands, their destinies sealed by the very blood that flowed through their veins. They were immortal, eternal beings, bound by the power of the Elden Ring and the divine forces that governed the world. But now, with the ring shattered and the world in ruins, the demigods found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered, the Tarnished, who had no ties to the gods and no fear of the powers that had once held the world in place. The Tarnished, though mortal, possessed a fire that no demigod could ever understand. They had been cast aside, forgotten by the gods, yet they were still determined to forge their own destiny. The demigods, in all their power, could not fathom the resolve of the Tarnished, whose very existence was a testament to the world's ability to rise from its own ashes. The Tarnished were not bound by the same chains that had kept the demigods in their place. They were free, free to act, free to choose their own path, free to challenge the broken world and the gods who had once ruled it. As the Tarnished made their way through the shattered lands, they encountered the demigods, each one a reflection of the power and ambition that had once defined the world. The demigods, for all their strength, were not invincible. Their fates, tied to the fractured Elden Ring, were as uncertain as the world itself. And so, the Tarnished came to challenge them, not out of malice, but out of a desire to restore the balance that had been lost, to heal the broken world and rebuild what had been shattered. But the path of the Tarnished was not an easy one. The demigods, for all their flaws, were still formidable opponents, and their power, though fractured, was still enough to crush the Tarnished. The world they inhabited was one of danger and decay, where every step could be your last, and every encounter could be your end. Yet the Tarnished pressed on, driven by something greater than mere survival. They were driven by the hope that through their struggle they might reclaim the world they had lost. The Tarnished were not alone in their journey. Along their path, they encountered others who had been affected by the shattering, beings both human and divine, those who had been touched by the same chaos that had shattered the Elden Ring. Some of these figures were allies, while others were enemies, each driven by their own desires and ambitions. Yet despite the many challenges they faced, the Tarnished pressed on, their resolve unbroken by the dangers of the world. The demigods, for their part, could not ignore the Tarnished. They were a constant reminder of what had been lost, of the world that had once been whole, but was now fragmented beyond repair. The Tarnished were not just a threat to their rule, they were a reminder that the gods and their creations were not invincible, that even the strongest of powers could be challenged by those who had nothing left to lose. As the Tarnished ventured deeper into the broken world, they encountered more of the demigods, each one a mirror of their own struggle. They fought not just for survival, but for something greater, a chance to reclaim their place in a world that had forgotten them. They were the last remnants of a world that had been shattered by the gods' own hands, and they would not rest until they had restored what had been lost. The demigods, in turn, saw in the Tarnished a challenge, a reflection of their own struggle for meaning in a world that had lost its purpose. They were no longer the rulers of the world, no longer the ones who held the power of the Elden Ring. and in the face of the tarnished, they were forced to confront the truth that their power was not eternal, that the world was not theirs to control. The tarnished, though mortal, were a symbol of the world's potential for rebirth, a force that could change the course of history. The battle between the tarnished and the demigods was not just a battle for control of the world, it was a battle for the very soul of the world itself. The tarnished, free from the chains of divine blood, sought to rebuild what had been shattered. The demigods, bound by their own power, sought to preserve the world as it was. And in the clash between these two forces, the fate of the world would be decided. In the shattered world, where the pieces of the Elden Ring lay scattered like broken dreams, there arose a final hope. It was a quiet hope, whispered among the ruins, a fragile thread woven through the hearts of the tarnished. These weary souls, forsaken by the gods and abandoned by the very forces that had once guided them, found within themselves the strength to rise once more. Their mission was simple yet immense: to reclaim the Elden Ring, to restore what had been lost, and to heal the wounds of a world that had been torn asunder. The Elden Ring, once the very essence of the world's order, had become a symbol of both power and despair. Its fracture had cast the lands between into chaos, and its absence had left a void that seemed impossible to fill. The gods, those divine beings who had once wielded the ring's power, were now broken, their influence waning as the world crumbled beneath their feet. The demigods, once supreme rulers of the lands, were now scattered, their fates uncertain, their power fractured. And so, the tarnished, those mortals who had once been cast aside, stepped forward, determined to forge a new destiny, one that would shape the future of the world. But the task before them was not one of simple action. It was a journey that would require sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to face the darkest parts of themselves. To reclaim the Elden Ring, the tarnished would have to confront not just the broken world, but the broken pieces of their own hearts. Each one of them carried with them the scars of the past, the weight of their own regrets, and the burden of their divine exile. But despite these burdens, they moved forward, their resolve unshaken, their purpose clear. For many, the journey to reclaim the Elden Ring was a path filled with doubt and uncertainty. They were not the gods, nor were they the demigods. They were mere mortals, born of dust and earth, cast aside by the very powers they sought to confront. But it was this very mortality that gave the tarnished their strength, their ability to fight without the certainty of divine favor, their willingness to face the unknown without the protection of immortality. They were free in a way that the gods and demigods could never be, and it was this freedom that made them a threat to the old order, a force that could no longer be ignored. The tarnished faced many trials on their journey, each more difficult than the last. They encountered creatures twisted by the Elden Ring's fracture, beasts of unimaginable power, guardians of ancient secrets who had long since abandoned their duties. The world was no longer the place it had once been, and the road to reclaim the Elden Ring was fraught with peril. But the tarnished pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the fate of the world rested in their hands. They knew that if they failed, the world would fall into darkness, consumed by the very chaos that had torn it apart. As the tarnished journeyed deeper into the heart of the broken world, they came to understand that their quest was not just about restoring the Elden Ring. It was about understanding the true nature of the world they sought to save. The Elden Ring, once a symbol of unity and power, was not merely a tool for the gods. It was the essence of the world itself, a reflection of the balance that had once held everything together. The shattering had not just fractured the ring, it had fractured the world, splintering it into pieces that could never be truly reunited. The Tarnished, in their quest to reclaim the Elden Ring, would have to face the harsh truth that the world they sought to restore could never return to what it once was. But despite this realization, the Tarnished did not falter. They understood that the world could not be undone, that the past could not be reclaimed. But they also knew that the future was theirs to shape, that they had the power to forge a new path, one that would honor the sacrifices of the past while creating something entirely new. To reclaim the Elden Ring was not just to restore the world, it was to redefine what it meant to be a part of it. It was a chance to heal the wounds of the past and build a future that was free from the constraints of divine rule, free from the cycles of suffering and pain that had plagued the world for so long. As they neared the final steps of their journey, the Tarnished were confronted with the ultimate question. What would they do with the power of the Elden Ring? The gods had used it to shape the world, to bend it to their will, and the demigods had sought to control it for their own gain. But the Tarnished were different. They were not bound by the same ambitions or desires. They had seen the world for what it truly was, a place of both beauty and sorrow, of light and darkness. And they understood that the power to shape the world did not lie in control, but in balance. The final battle for the Elden Ring was not one of brute force, but of understanding. The Tarnished would have to confront not just the broken pieces of the world, but the broken pieces of themselves. They would have to face the darkness within their own hearts, the doubts and fears that had held them back for so long. And in that confrontation, they would either find redemption or fall into the same cycle of destruction that had claimed the gods before them. As the Tarnished stood at the precipice of the world's fate, they knew that the future was uncertain. The Elden Ring, once a symbol of hope, was now a symbol of the world's brokenness. But even in its shattered form, it held the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to heal the world and redefine what it meant to live within it. The power to shape the world was no longer in the hands of the gods. It was in the hands of those who dared to rise against them, those who dared to challenge the very forces that had once ruled the lands between. The Tarnished, though mortal, were the last hope for the world. And as they reached out to reclaim the Elden Ring, they did so not just for themselves, but for all those who had been lost, for all those who had suffered in the wake of the gods' ambition. The future was theirs to shape, and they would face whatever came with the courage of those who had nothing left to lose. The lands between, once a realm of harmony and divine order, had become a battlefield, its skies darkened by the shadow of the Elden Ring's fracture. Where once there had been unity, now there was only division. The land that had been shaped by the gods, a place of balance, was now teetering on the edge of chaos. And in this fractured world, the struggle for power had become the driving force behind every action, every movement, every decision. The demigods, once bound by their divine bloodlines and the power of the Elden Ring, now found themselves locked in a desperate fight for dominance, each seeking to claim what remained of the world. The influence of the Elden Ring, once a stabilizing force, had become the very thing that fractured the world. As its power waned, the demigods turned against one another, each desperate to seize control of the broken realm. The once immense power that had defined their existence now seemed fleeting, and as the world crumbled, the demigods saw the opportunity to forge their own destiny. But in doing so, they unleashed a struggle that would tear apart the very land they had been tasked to protect. The tarnished, those mortals who had been cast aside by the gods, were not untouched by this power struggle. Though they were not born of divine blood, they understood the stakes. The demigods, thus locked in their endless conflict, were blind to the destruction they caused. But the tarnished, driven by their desire to restore the Elden Ring and rebuild the world, knew that the power struggles of the demigods were only furthering the world's decay. They could not afford to let the chaos continue, and so they stepped forward, willing to take on the demigods and challenge the old order. But the tarnished were not the only ones who sought to reshape the world. The forces of chaos, led by the mysterious Three Fingers, sought to seize the broken world for their own, to turn it into something entirely different. Their influence, subtle and insidious, had already begun to take root in the hearts of the demigods and mortals alike. The Three Fingers promised a world without the constraints of order, a world where power would no longer be defined by the gods, but by those who embraced the chaos within. The struggle for power in the lands between was not simply a war for control, it was a war for the very soul of the world. The demigods, blinded by their own ambitions, fought not just for dominion over the land, but for the chance to impose their will upon it. And as they waged war against one another, the world itself was being torn apart. The Elden Ring's fracture was no longer just a symbol of the gods' failure. It was the physical manifestation of the world's descent into chaos. And yet, even as the forces of destruction gathered, there was still the faintest glimmer of hope. The tarnished, though mortal, and cast aside by the gods, understood that the world was not defined by the powers that sought to control it. It was defined by the hearts of those who fought to protect it, to restore it. The tarnished did not seek power for its own sake. They sought to heal, to mend the world that had been broken. In their hearts, there was no desire for dominion, only for the chance to rebuild. The world of the Elden Ring, once a place of divine beauty, was now a shadow of its former self. The lands, ravaged by the shattering, lay broken and barren, a reflection of the fractured state of the world. Yet even in the face of destruction, the lands between still held the potential for renewal. The land itself whispered of rebirth, of a future that could be forged from the ashes of the past. But that future would not come easily. It would take more than just strength. It would take unity, determination, and the willingness to face the darkness within. The demigods, though powerful, were not invincible. Their ambitions had brought them to the brink of ruin, and their infighting had left them weakened. The lands they once ruled were now crumbling beneath their feet, and the Elden Ring they had once controlled was now beyond their grasp. The world they sought to control was slipping away, and in their desperation, they clung to the shattered remnants of power, unaware that their actions were hastening the world's demise. As the tarnished pressed on, they encountered the last remnants of the gods' influence. The ruins of the old world, once home to the gods and demigods, now lay abandoned, their former glory reduced to dust. But even in these ruins, there was power, power that had been left behind, waiting for someone to claim it. The tarnished, though not born of divine blood, were now the ones who had the chance to restore the Elden Ring. They understood that the path to redemption was not one of violence or domination, but one of healing, of rebuilding what had been lost. The struggle for power in the lands between was not just a battle for control, it was a battle for the world's soul. The demigods, caught in their own ambitions, were blind to the true cost of their actions. The tarnished, with their quiet resolve and unyielding spirit, were the last hope for the world. They were the ones who could restore the Elden Ring, rebuild the fractured world, and bring balance back to the lands that had once known peace. But the journey would not be easy. The forces of chaos, led by the Three Fingers, were waiting in the shadows, ready to seize the broken world and turn it into something unrecognizable. The demigods, consumed by their desire for power, would stop at nothing to retain their hold over the world. The tarnished would have to face not just the forces of destruction, but the very darkness within themselves. The world of the Elden Ring, once defined by the power of the gods, was now defined by the struggle for control. And in that struggle, the tarnished were the last hope for the future, a future where the world could be healed, rebuilt, and made whole once more. The world, now divided and in turmoil, seemed to be caught in an endless cycle, one of hope and ruin. The lands between, once a place of divine harmony, now found itself caught between light and darkness, between the ideals of the gods and the realities of a fractured existence. The Elden Ring, its power shattered, had left behind not only a physical rift in the world, but also a spiritual one, a divide that ran deep into the hearts of all who inhabited this broken land. For centuries, the gods and demigods had ruled with the power of the Elden Ring, and in its light the world had flourished. But now, with the shattering, the very foundation of the world had crumbled, and all that remained was the cycle of destruction and rebirth, of hope rising only to fall once again. The struggle for control, for dominance, had become the driving force of all who still sought the power that had once defined them. The tarnished, those mortals who had been forsaken by the gods, now stood as the last hope to break this cycle, to end the endless rise and fall of power that had caused so much suffering. They were not the gods or the demigods. They were the ones who had been cast aside, forgotten, and yet they now found themselves standing on the precipice of a new era, one where they could reshape the world and rewrite the cycle of hope and ruin. But the path to that new world was not an easy one. The forces that had shaped the world for so long, the gods, the demigods, the Three Fingers, and the chaos they wrought, were not easily defeated. The tarnished would have to face not only the remnants of the gods' power, but also the darkness that had taken root within their own hearts. For even the tarnished, who had been cast aside, carried with them the weight of the past, the hopes and regrets of a world that had been shattered and left behind. And yet, despite the overwhelming challenges before them, the tarnished pressed on, driven by a deep, unrelenting desire to restore the world to what it had once been. They understood that the world, in its fractured state, could never truly return to its former glory. The Elden Ring, once the source of order and balance was gone, and with it, the foundation of the world had been forever altered. But the tarnished also understood that there was something more important than restoring the world to what it had been. There was the opportunity to forge something new, to create a future that was free from the mistakes of the past. The cycle of hope and ruin had been set in motion by the gods themselves, by the creation of the Elden Ring and the order it imposed. The demigods, thus born from the gods' power, had inherited this cycle, each one carrying the weight of the divine legacy that had been passed down to them. But now, with the Elden Ring shattered, that cycle was broken. The world was no longer defined by the gods' will, nor by the demigods' ambition. It was now defined by the choices of those who stood at the crossroads of the past and the future, the tarnished. The tarnished were not bound by the same rules that had governed the gods and demigods. They were not defined by their divine heritage or their bloodlines. They were free in a way that the gods and demigods could never be. And it was this freedom that gave them the power to break the cycle, to forge a new path for the world. But with that freedom came a heavy burden, the burden of choice. The tarnished would have to decide not only what kind of world they wanted to create, but also what kind of future they wanted to build. For in the wake of the Elden Ring's fracture, the world was no longer a place of certainty, it was a place of possibility. But possibility, like hope, can be fleeting. The world, though filled with potential, was also filled with darkness, darkness that threatened to consume all who sought to shape the future. The demigods, with their ambitions and desires, were not easily deterred. They still sought to claim the power of the Elden Ring for themselves, to reshape the world in their image, and the forces of chaos, led by the Three Fingers, sought to destroy all that remained of the world, to unmake the very fabric of existence. The tarnished would face these forces head on, their resolve unshaken by the overwhelming darkness that threatened to engulf them. They knew that the future was uncertain, that the world was fragile, and that their journey would not be without cost. But they also knew that they were the ones who held the power to break the cycle of destruction and rebuild the world. They would not let the past dictate the future. They would not let the mistakes of the gods, the demigods, and the forces of chaos define the world they sought to create. The tarnished were not the saviors of the world. They were its stewards, its caretakers, its guardians. They understood that the world had been broken, but they also understood that it could be healed. The cycle of hope and ruin did not have to continue. The tarnished would fight to restore the world, not to what it had been, but to something better. They would rebuild, not in the image of the gods, but in the image of those who had been forgotten, those who had been cast aside, those who had never been given a chance. The battle for the world was not just a battle for power, it was a battle for the future itself. The tarnished understood that the world could no longer be ruled by the whims of the gods or the desires of the demigods. The world belonged to those who were willing to fight for it, to those who had nothing left to lose. The tarnished were the last hope for the world, and in their struggle, they would decide the fate of the lands between. The world, broken and fragmented, seemed to exist on the precipice of something new, something unknown. The divine power that had once shaped the world, that had once held everything together, was no longer a guiding force. The Elden Ring, shattered and destroyed, had once been the very essence of order, the binding force that had united the gods and the world. But with its fracture, the world was now adrift, its fate uncertain, its future unclear. The age of the gods had ended. The reign of divine beings, of demigods and immortal rulers, had come to a close. The gods, once omnipotent and unchallenged, were now but shadows of their former selves. The Elden Ring, the source of their power, had been destroyed, and with it, the very foundation of their rule. The world had shifted, and in that shift, the gods were no longer the rulers. They were mere remnants of an age that had passed. For centuries, the gods had ruled over the lands between with the power of the Elden Ring, shaping the world to their will, creating a realm where their divine influence was absolute. But as the gods grew more distant, more removed from the very world they had created, the cracks in their reign began to show. The Elden Ring, once the symbol of their unity, had become the source of their downfall. The power that had once held the world together now lay shattered, leaving the gods to face the consequences of their own hubris. The demigods, born of the gods' blood, had once been their chosen heirs, the ones who would inherit the mantle of power and carry the legacy of the gods into the future. But the fracture of the Elden Ring had disrupted that order. The demigods, each one bound to the ring, now found themselves caught in the struggle for control, vying for the remnants of the power that had once been theirs. Their fates, once sealed by the will of the gods, were now uncertain. The Elden Ring had shattered, and with it, the divine order had crumbled. In the wake of the gods' fall, the tarnished, those mortals who had been cast aside, emerged as the last hope for the world. The tarnished were not born of divine blood. They were not bound to the gods by fate or destiny. They were free, untainted by the power struggles that had consumed the gods and demigods. And it was this freedom, this independence, that made the tarnished the only ones capable of reclaiming the world and restoring what had been lost. The age of the gods was over, and in its place, a new age was beginning. An age where the power of the gods no longer defined the world, where the future could be shaped by those who were not bound by divine will. The tarnished, though mortal and cast aside, now held the power to decide the world's fate. The gods, once the rulers of all, were now relegated to the past, their power faded, their influence waning. But even as the gods' reign ended, the remnants of their power still lingered in the world. The Elden Ring, though shattered, still held fragments of its former strength. These fragments, scattered across the lands between, were the key to the world's rebirth. The tarnished, in their quest to reclaim the Elden Ring, sought to gather these fragments, to restore what had been broken, and to heal the world's wounds. But to do so, they would have to face not only the remnants of the gods' power, but also the forces of chaos that had risen in the wake of the Elden Ring's destruction. The three fingers, those agents of destruction, sought to turn the broken world into something unrecognizable. They represented the chaos that had consumed the Elden Ring, the very force that had shattered the world and caused the gods' fall. Their influence, though subtle, was undeniable. They whispered to the weak, to those who sought escape from the pain of the world, offering them the promise of a new order, one without the constraints of the gods. The tarnished, however, were not swayed by the three fingers' promises. They knew that the world could not be rebuilt through chaos. The gods had once created the Elden Ring to bring order to the worlds, and it was that order, though imperfect, that had held the world together. The Tarnished sought not to destroy, but to restore, to rebuild what had been lost in the wake of the gods' fall. They understood that the path forward was not one of domination or destruction, but of healing, of bringing balance back to a broken world. As the Tarnished continued their journey, they found themselves at the crossroads of the past and the future. The age of the gods had ended, but what would follow? The power that had once ruled the world was no longer in the hands of the divine. The gods, once the arbiters of fate, were now silent, their influence fading into the annals of history. And in their place, the Tarnished stood, free from the chains that had bound the gods, free to shape the world as they saw fit. The gods had ruled the world for so long, their power absolute, their will unquestioned. But now, in the wake of their fall, the world was free, free to be reshaped, free to be reborn. The Tarnished, though burdened by the weight of their past, carried with them the hope of a new future, one that could be built not on the ruins of the gods, but on the strength of their own resolve. They would not allow the cycle of destruction to continue. The world had been shattered, but it was not beyond repair. The Tarnished, in their quiet defiance, would reclaim the Elden Ring and restore the balance that had been lost. The end of the age of the gods marked the beginning of a new era, an era where the power of the gods no longer ruled over the world. The Tarnished, though mortal, now held the fate of the world in their hands. They would either restore the Elden Ring and bring balance to the world, or they would fall to the same chaos that had claimed the gods before them. The world, once ruled by divine power, was now free to be shaped by those who dared to rise against the gods' will. Thank you, dear friends, for joining me on this journey through the fractured world of the Elden Ring, where the gods have fallen and the fate of the lands between rests in the hands of those who once were forgotten. Through the rise and fall of the demigods, through the struggles of the Tarnished, we have seen a world on the edge of renewal, a world where hope and ruin exist side by side, and where the future can still be shaped by those willing to defy the past. As we close the chapter on this tale, let your mind drift as the echoes of the Elden Ring's shattered power fade into the silence of night. Feel the weight of the journey and know that in every story, even one filled with chaos and loss, there is always the possibility of rebirth. The lands may be broken, but the future is still unwritten. The Tarnished, the once forgotten, have the power to rebuild, and perhaps, in their hands, the world will find its second chance. Take a deep breath now, and let the quiet calm settle over you. Allow the story to rest as you drift into peaceful dreams where the hope for a new world can blossom and the journey continues on just beyond the horizon. Good night.